You're arriving at the hospital after a marathon drive, ready to meet your first grandchild only to be stopped at the door by your own son. But that's not even the craziest part. 4 days later, I got a phone call that changed everything. Want? To know what they asked me to pay for? You'll have to hear this to believe it. Let me set the scene for you, because this is one of those stories that starts with a phone call and ends with a whole lot more than I bargained for. It was 3 a.m., the kind of hour when the world is so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat. I was already half awake, tossing and turning, because I had a feeling in my bones that something big was about to happen. And sure enough, my phone lit up on the nightstand. It was my son, and his voice was a mix of nerves and excitement. "Mom, it's time. She's in labor." That was all I needed to hear. I didn't even hesitate. Was out of bed, suitcase already packed because, let's be honest, us grandmas are always prepared for anything, and I was running on pure adrenaline. I kissed my husband goodbye. He mumbled something about drive safe and call me when you get there. But I was already halfway out the door. The house was dark, the world was asleep, but my heart was wide awake. I slid behind the wheel, started the car, and took a deep breath. 15 hours. That's what the GPS said. 15 hours between me and my very first grandchild. Now I know. What you're thinking? 15 hours? Are you out of your mind? Maybe I was. But when your baby calls you to say his baby's on the way, you don't think about the miles. You just go. I hit the road, the highway stretching out in front of me like a ribbon of hope. The first few hours were easy. The sky was still dark, the world was quiet, and I had the road all to myself. I turned on the radio oldies, of course, because nothing keeps you awake like belting out a little Aretha Franklin at the top of your lungs. By sunrise, I was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, sipping my first gas station coffee. You know, the kind burnt, bitter, but somehow exactly what you need. I called my son for an update. "Still waiting," he said, sounding both exhausted and exhilarated. I could hear the beeping of hospital machines in the background, and for a moment, I wished I could just teleport myself there. But instead, I got back in the car and kept driving. The hours started to blur together. I passed endless fields, sleepy, little towns, and more billboards for fireworks and pecan pie than I could count. Somewhere around hour 6, I stopped for breakfast. Now let me tell you, if you ever find yourself at a truck stop in the middle of Kansas, do yourself a favor and skip the breakfast burrito. I'm not saying it was bad, but let's just say my stomach and I had a little disagreement for the next 100 miles. But nothing could dampen my excitement. I kept picturing that moment, walking into the hospital, seeing my son's face, holding my grandson for the very first time. I imagined what he'd look like, whose nose he'd have, if he'd have my son's wild hair or his wife's sweet smile. I thought about all the things I wanted to tell him, all the stories I wanted to share. I even practiced my grandma voice a few times just to make sure I had it right. Don't laugh, you know you've done it too. By hour 10, I was starting to feel it. My back ached, my legs were stiff, and I was pretty sure I'd listened to every song on the radio twice. But every time I thought about stopping, I remembered why I was doing this. I remembered the way my son sounded on the phone, like a little boy and a grown man all at once. I remembered the way my own mother showed up for me, no matter what. And I kept going. I stopped for my third coffee somewhere just outside the city. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I took a moment to stretch, to breathe, to let it all sink in. I was about to become a grandma. Me. The woman who still feels 25 on the inside, even if my knees disagree. I laughed at myself, took a selfie in the parking lot because if you don't document it, did it even happen? And got back on the road. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, I pulled into the hospital parking lot. My heart was pounding. My hands were shaking, and I was so tired I could barely see straight. But none of that mattered. I was here. I made it. I grabbed my bag, smoothed my hair in the rearview mirror, and practically skipped through those hospital doors. I was ready, so ready to meet my grandson. Now, let me ask you, have you ever been so excited you forgot how tired you were? Was me floating on a cloud of anticipation, grinning like a fool at every nurse and doctor I passed. I could already hear the baby's cries in my head, feel the weight of him in my arms. But life, as we all know, loves a good plot twist. And, as I would soon find out, my journey was far from over. I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling of walking through those hospital doors, my heart practically leaping out of my chest. After 15 hours on the road, I was running on nothing but hope and the promise of holding my very first grandchild. The hospital was buzzing with that special kind of energy, nurses hustling, families whispering, the faint smell of coffee and antiseptic in the air. I clutched my bag a little tighter, scanning the hallway for my son. And then, there he was. My boy. He looked older than I remembered, a little more tired, but still my baby. My heart just about burst with pride and relief. I was ready to wrap him in a big, congratulatory hug, to tell him how proud I was, how much I loved him, how I'd driven all night just to be here for this moment. But before I could even get the words out, he stopped me. Not with a hug, not with a smile, but with a look I'll never forget. He looked tired, yes, but there was something else in his eyes, something nervous, almost apologetic. He took a deep breath, and I could see the weight of the world on his shoulders. Mom, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing here? For a split second, I thought he was joking. I mean, wasn't it obvious? I was here for him, for his wife, for my grandson. I was here because that's what mothers do. But then he continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. My wife. She said she doesn't want you around right now. I swear I felt the floor drop out from under me. It was like stepping on a Lego in the dark sharp. Unexpected, and it hurt in a way I can't quite describe. I wanted to argue, to plead my case, to say, but I drove 15 hours. I'm your mother. I just want to help. I wanted to tell him how I'd imagined this moment, how I'd pictured holding his hand, meeting my grandson, being part of this new chapter in his life, but I saw the look in his eyes, tired, nervous, desperate to keep the peace. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't about me. This was about him, about his wife, about their new little family. So I did what any mom would do. I swallowed my pride, blinked back the tears that were threatening to spill over, and gave him a hug. It wasn't the hug I'd imagined, but it was all I could give. I told him I loved him. That I understood, even though I didn't, not really. I wanted to ask why, to demand an explanation, but I could see he was already stretched thin. So I let it go. I turned around, my heart heavy, and walked back down that hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was carrying the weight of all the years I'd spent loving him, raising him, hoping to be part of his life forever. I made it to the parking lot before the tears came. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, and just let myself cry. Not the quiet, dignified tears you see in movies, but the ugly, snotty, full-body sobs that leave you feeling empty and raw. I drove to the hotel in a daze, barely remembering the route. The room was cold and impersonal, the kind of place where nobody knows your name or your story. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, replaying the conversation over and over in my head. What had I done wrong? Was it something I said? Something I did? Was I too much? Too eager to present? Or was it just the stress of the moment, the exhaustion, the newness of it all? I thought about calling my husband, but I didn't want to worry him. I thought about calling my friends, but I didn't want to admit how much it hurt. So I just sat there, feeling invisible in my own family. Have you ever felt that way, Kay? Like you're on the outside looking in, like you're suddenly a guest in a life you helped build. It's a special kind of pain, one that doesn't have a name but lingers all the same. I thought about all the times I'd shown up for my son's school plays, scraped knees, heartbreaks, and triumphs. I thought about the sacrifices, the late nights, the endless love. And now, here I was, alone in a hotel room, shut out of one of the most important moments of his life. But even in the midst of my hurt, I knew I had to respect their wishes. I reminded myself that this wasn't about me, that sometimes love means stepping back, even when it breaks your heart. I tried to find comfort in the thought that my son was starting his own family, making his own choices, carving out his own path. I told myself that one day, maybe things would be different. Maybe I'd get to hold my grandson, to tell him stories, to be the grandma I'd always dreamed of being. That night, I cried myself to sleep, the ache in my chest a reminder of just how much I loved them. And as I drifted off, I promised myself that no matter how hard it was, I would always show up. For my family, even if it meant waiting outside the door that didn't open. For days. That's how long it had been since I'd driven all those miles, only to be turned away at the hospital door. 4 days since I'd hugged my son in that sterile hallway, blinked back tears, and tried to convince myself that respecting boundaries was just another way of loving your family. I'd made the long drive home in a fog, the radio off, my thoughts swirling like autumn leaves in a storm. I kept replaying everything in my mind, my son's tired face. The words I never got to say. The moment I realized I was no longer the center of his world. I tried to keep busy, folding laundry, watering the plants, even organizing the junk drawer, which, let's be honest, is a sign of true emotional distress. But no matter what I did, the ache in my chest wouldn't go away. I was happy for them. Of course I was. But I couldn't help feeling like I'd missed out on something precious. Something I'd been waiting for my whole life. So when the phone rang that afternoon, I almost didn't answer. I was elbow deep in a pile of old photos, sorting through memories of birthday parties and first days of school, when the shrill ring jolted me back to the present. I glanced at the caller IDN. Unfamiliar number. For a split second, I wondered if it was my son finally calling to say, "Come meet your grandson, Mom." My heart did a little hopeful leap as I picked up the phone. "Hello," I said, trying to sound casual, like I hadn't been waiting for this call for days. But it wasn't my son. It was a woman with a brisk, businesslike voice. "Hello, is this Mrs. Thompson?" she asked. "Yes, this is she," I replied, my mind racing. Was this about the hotel? The car rental? Had I left something behind in my emotional haze? "I'm calling from the billing department at St. Mary's Hospital," she continued. "We have you listed as the responsible party for your grandson's delivery. The total amount due is $10,200. How would you like to pay?" For a moment, I was sure I'd misheard her. I actually looked around the room as if someone might pop out and say, "Just kidding." But no, it was just me, the cat, and a stack of old Polaroids. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a little higher than usual. "Did you say I owed $10,000 for a baby I didn't even get to hold?" There was a pause on the other end, the kind that makes you wonder if you've slipped into some alternate universe where grandparenting comes with a price tag. I almost laughed, almost. The absurdity of it all was just too much. I mean, I'd been through a lot in my life, but never had I been billed for a grandchild. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "I think you've got the wrong grandma," I said, injecting as much humor as I could muster, "but if you're offering visitation rights with that bill, I'll consider it." There was another pause, and then, to my surprise, the woman on the other end actually chuckled. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. There must be some mistake. Let me double-check the records." As she put me on hold, I sat there shaking my head, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth for the first time in days. Who knew being a grandma came with an invoice? Do I get a frequent flyer discount for emotional baggage? Maybe a coupon for every hour spent worrying, or a punch card for every time I've bitten my tongue instead of saying what I really think. I pictured myself at the hospital billing desk, negotiating like I was at a yard sale. "I'll pay half. If you throw in a few baby snuggles and a family photo, the woman came back on the line apologizing profusely for the mix-up. Apparently, my name had been listed as an emergency contact, and somewhere along the way, wires got crossed. "No worries," I told her, still smiling. "But if you ever need a stand-in, Grandma, you know who to call." We both laughed, and for a moment, the heaviness in my heart lifted just a little. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet for a while, letting the absurdity of the situation wash over me. It was just so perfectly imperfect, so typical of the way life throws curveballs when you least expect it. I thought about calling my son to tell him the story, to share a laugh, to maybe bridge the gap that had grown between us. But I hesitated. I didn't want to add to his stress, didn't want to make him feel guilty or pressured. So instead, I wrote it all down in my journal. The way I always do when I need to make sense of things. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something important. Sometimes life doesn't go the way you planned. Sometimes you drive 15 hours and end up sitting alone in a hotel room. Sometimes you get billed for a baby you never got to hold. But even in the midst of disappointment, there's room for laughter, for grace, for hope. And maybe, just maybe, that's what being a grandma is all about. Loving fiercely. Showing up and finding joy in the most unexpected places. After the shock of that hospital bill wore off and after I'd told the story to my cat, who seemed only mildly interested, I realized I couldn't just let things sit the way they were. The whole experience, from the 15-hour drive to the emotional roller coaster in the hospital hallway, had left me with a heart full of questions and a head full of what-ifs. I knew I needed to talk to my son, not just about the bill, but about everything that had happened. So I picked up the phone, took a deep breath, and dialed his number. My hands were shaking a little, but I told myself that if I could survive childbirth, raising a teenager, and a surprise $10,200 invoice, I could survive one honest conversation. He answered on the second ring, sounding tired but happy. I could hear the faintest cooing in the background, and my heart squeezed with longing. We started with small talk. How was the baby? How was his wife? Was everyone sleeping at all? But I could feel the tension, the unspoken words hanging between us like laundry on a line. Finally, I just blurted it out. "Honey, I got a call from the hospital. Apparently, I'm the proud owner of a $10,200 baby I haven't even met yet." There was a pause, and then he burst out laughing. It was the first time I'd heard him really laugh in weeks, and it was contagious. I started laughing too, and for a moment, all the hurt and awkwardness melted away. Once we'd caught our breath, we started talking, really talking. I told him how much it hurt to be turned away, how I'd felt invisible and left out, how I'd questioned every decision I'd ever made as a mother. He listened, really listened, and then he told me his side. He said the delivery had been harder than they'd expected, that his wife was overwhelmed and scared, and that in the chaos, they'd both just wanted to keep things as simple as possible. He admitted that maybe they could have handled it better, that maybe he should have found a way to include me, even if it was just a quick visit or a phone call. We talked about boundaries, how important they are, but also how hard they can be to set and respect, especially when emotions are running. We talked about love too, about how sometimes, even when you do everything right, things don't go as planned. About how family isn't about being perfect or always getting it right, but about showing up even when it hurts. Even when you're not sure you're wanted. Even when you have to swallow your pride and wait in the wings. I told him that I loved him, that I loved his wife, and that I already loved my grandson more than I thought possible. I told him that I'd always be there, even if there sometimes meant being a little further away than I'd like. He apologized, and I could hear the sincerity in his voice. He said he was grateful for me for all the ways I'd shown up for him over the years, and that he hoped I'd get to meet the baby soon. We both cried a little happy tears this time, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't A perfect conversation, but it was real, and it was enough. And as for that hospital bill, turns out it was just a mix-up. Some poor soul in the billing department had confused my emergency contact information with the responsible party for payment. My son called the hospital and got it all sorted out, and we all had a good laugh about it. I joked that if I was going to pay for a baby, I at least wanted naming rights or a lifetime supply of baby snuggles. He promised I'd get both, and for the first time since this whole adventure began, I felt like everything was going to be okay. In the days that followed, started to see the humor in the whole situation. I mean, who else can say they got billed for a grandchild they hadn't even met? It became the story I told to friends over coffee, to my husband at dinner, and to anyone who would listen at the grocery store. It was the story that broke the ice when I finally got to meet my grandsonner, beautiful, squirmy little bundle with his father's eyes and his mother's smile. I held him in my arms, breathed in that sweet baby smell, and whispered, "You were worth every mile, every tear, and yes, even every penny." Looking back, I realized that life is full of moments like this. Messy, complicated, sometimes painful, but always worth it in the end. We don't always get the storybook moments we dream of, but we get real ones, and those are the ones that matter. Family isn't about perfection. It's about love, forgiveness, and the willingness to laugh at ourselves when things go sideways. It's about showing up even when the door doesn't open, and finding joy in the unexpected. So now, every time we gather as a family, someone inevitably brings up Grandma's hospital bill, and we all laugh until we cry. It's become our little inside joke, a reminder that even when things don't go as planned, we're in it together. And that, I think, is the greatest lesson of all. So if you've ever felt left out, misunderstood, or just plain exhausted by family drama, you're not alone. We all have our hospital bill moments. But hey, if we can't laugh about it, what's the point? If you enjoyed this story, hit that subscribe button for more real-life tales, a few laughs, and maybe a little wisdom along the way. And tell me in the comments, what's the wildest thing you've ever done for family? I'd love to hear your stories.